It's
Yeah,
causes
personally.
anxiety. Like, why is it mad? Why
Yeah,
am I
exactly.
mad?
But I looked it up one day, and it's because like if you gave your daughter money to go on a date in case she got mad at her date, she had money to get herself home with. It's like
Really?
a,
Ah,
That's the origin?
I think so. I looked it up like 3 years ago because I was just curious, but that's what I remember. So don't quote me, but I think that's what it is. All right, this is episode 48 of Farm to Markets, and we were talking about the carried interest loophole, if the definition of recession is changing, and we have our first ever mailbag round at the end. Last week, Senate Democrats proposed closing the carried interest loophole as part of the $739 billion Inflation Reduction Act. Carried interest is basically a way for hedge fund and private equity managers to reclassify their income as interest, which is taxed at the more favorable capital gains rate as opposed to earned income. What do you think? Do you think the carried interest loophole should be closed?
well, in general, this has been something that not just Democrats have wanted for a while, but even when Donald Trump was running for president, he was talking about closing this quote unquote loophole, to have this income taxed as income. So in general, I prefer flatter rate taxes than I do with all these different specialty taxes that are all taxed at slightly different rates. So in that sense, I would say, yeah, we should probably close it, quote unquote, I guess. But the reason is and we're going to talk about this when we talk about recession here in a minute, but I think it's kind of absurd to redefine things that they obviously aren't so that you can treat them differently than they otherwise should be. And to me, that's really all this is. I don't have a problem with hedge fund owners or managers making a lot of money. I just think it's kind of ridiculous that you would call something that's obviously income, interest, so that it could be taxed at a lower rate. I think everything should be taxed at a lower rate in general. So it's not like I think we should be sticking it to these hedge fund managers or, tax the rich or anything like that. It's just, let's stop pretending that, all kinds of different things, this included, aren't things that they actually are, or are things that they actually aren't. I would say close it. Let's just streamline all these taxes in general.
I think carried interest it's a tough issue to boil down to either good or bad. And I think its appropriateness is largely determined by what side of the field you're playing on. For example, if I'm cold, I want hot tea. If I'm hot, I want iced tea. So in the case of carried interest, obviously, if you're a venture capitalist or a hedge fund manager or a private equity fund manager, or I don't know, some super laissez-faire capitalist, you probably like the idea of having this carried interest loophole. Now, if you're anyone else, you probably see this tax provision as a loophole that only serves to make the rich richer. So in theory, I kind of like the idea of rewarding people who take financial risks to invest in companies that innovate or produce more efficiently. I think that helps an economy grow rapidly. However, the way the current carried interest provision operates is it only really applies to venture capital, private equity, and hedge fund managers. Now, if you're a limited partner and you're pouring money into these funds or investments, your profits can still be taxed at ordinary income or long-term capital gains rates, whereas the 20% for the general partners or the managers is always taxed at that. That seems a little strange to me. The way I see it is the managers are getting the much better end of the stick, as they don't necessarily have to actually invest any of their own money or capital. They just manage the fund, and they're rewarded quite nicely if it happens to turn a profit. So the question is, what ought to happen? Should we do away with it, or should we keep it? In my utopia, we would treat all investment income as capital gains. We'd also allow anyone to invest in venture capital, private equity, or hedge funds, regardless of whether they're an accredited investor or not. I think it's way more unfair to limit investment options to unaccredited investors than it is to reward fund managers. So instead of closing the loop, I say make it wider. increase the incentives for people to take risks and invest and compete in the overall economy.
My analogy is, it's basically like clubbing. It's basically like asking, do you want to club baby seals or do you want to club baby elephants? I would prefer that you didn't do either. And that's the same thing with the tax loophole. It's like, do you want to close it? Do you want to keep it open? It's like, I don't know. I prefer that it just wasn't. I prefer that, like you guys said, that everybody was taxed at the capital gains rate in general. So in my opinion on the carried interest loophole, is somewhat, I have mixed feelings about it because I just feel like, like you guys, I wish everybody was taxed at the capital gains rate anyways. You could make an argument for trickle down theory, but I don't think that really applies here because it's only a specific group, like you said, private equity managers, hedge fund managers, that are getting taxed differently than like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. So in that case, I don't think trickle down theory really works in that case. There's, some of the lobbies use the argument that this is going to hurt pension plans and that pension plans are going to pass the extra cost onto middle class onto the middle class, but a lot of pensions have said we're not going to do that, and if they do pass costs on, it's not going to have it's basically going to have an immaterial difference. You also have Warren Buffett and Bill Ackman who are advocating to close the carried interest loophole. So so if you want to go ahead and close it, great. I'm all for it. Whether it gets closed or not, I don't know. Because like Alex says that, Obama talked about closing the carried interest loophole. Trump talked about closing the carried interest loophole. Now Biden's doing it. But the thing is that the people who make all this money make political donations. And that's why it's been so hard to close, is because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. And the carried interest loophole exists to this day, most likely because of that reason. So if you want to close it, great. But I personally, I don't know if it actually gets closed or not.
My libertarian side, if the loophole keeps on existing, doesn't that just incentivize people to become venture capitalists and hedge fund and private equity fund managers? Like, isn't that a good thing?
But eventually,
Hey, I want to do that when I grow up because it's, you get a loophole.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. All right. Next question is that, so last week on Twitter, there was a big debate about if the White House is trying to change the definition of a recession. And this is all stems from a post that came from the White House blog entitled, "How Do Economists Define Whether the Economy is in a Recession?" And we had this conversation on a previous Farm to Markets about, if we're in a recession or not, and it kind of boiled down to the definition. So do you think that the White House is trying to change the definition, or what do you think's happening here?
So the general public's definition has more or less been 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is a recession. It's never really been quite that simple, but that's pretty much generally how most economists determine, for the most part, whether or not we're in a recession. Tom alluded to the social media post from the White House. They were clearly trying to front run this, get out in front of it, and to say, like, we're about to be told we're probably in a recession, but here's why we're actually not. In reality, recession is something that we could probably just define as anything we want it to be. I think, though, I won't go back over all the data. We looked at it somewhat in one of our previous videos, but if you look at like producer price indexes, consumer spending, the number of job openings, et cetera, basically every major indicator you look at as a recession is flashing red, with the exception of a tight labor market and some wages. There's, so to me, there's really no denying that the White House is trying to redefine it. And the reason I think they're doing so is obviously political. Midterms are coming. Democrats are on the losing end of a lot of issues, although, things like Roe versus Wade's overturn is kind of a wild card here. But, there are geopolitical problems in the world that when you run the House, the Senate, and the White House, you get blamed for their economic problems. That when you run the House, the Senate, and the White House, you get blamed for. Throwing recession on top of this spreading bonfire is only going to get, worse, make things worse for Democrats. So trying to get out there and say, well, that's not really the real definition of recession, even though for the most part it generally has been, it makes sense politically, but I think it's pretty obvious they're trying to play word games with what's happening.
I think Americans are wanting somebody to tell them what the expiration date is on their milk. Right now, there's no expiration date on the milk, but it's been a few days. It smells fine. It tastes fine. But by golly, if I take a sip past the expiration date, I'll surely die. That's kind of what I see this argument over whether we're in a recession or not. To answer the question, I don't think the White House is trying to pull a fast one. In fact, I read their blog and it seemed pretty accurate. To kind of go back to last week's video, there's only one group that can declare recession. That's the National Bureau of Economic Research. And they're not tied to the definition of 2 quarters of consecutive negative growth in GDP. They look at things like income, spending, jobs, production, and all sorts of other things. And they decide when the economy is actually in a recession. So just going off of GDP isn't great. GDP can be a weird number. It hasn't always been the best indicator of the health of an economy. Yes, GDP has gone down consecutively for 2 quarters. But if you really look at the data, average job growth is booming over the first 6 months of this year. Production is booming. Corporate revenues are increasing. So I'd hardly call that a recession, and neither would the National Bureau of Economic Research. Will they declare a recession sometimes? Yeah, probably. I think in the next few months, they certainly could. But look out your front door. Have you lost your job? Have you lost your home? Have you lost the supermajority of your investment income? Things aren't great. That's definitely for sure, but we're not in the throes of a full recession yet. So don't rely on the tweets to determine whether you should fret a recession. Look out your front door and assess your own situation. If the milk still smells fine, if it tastes fine, odds are it's still probably fine for a while.
Yeah, I don't think they're trying to pull a fast one, and and you're right. They're not trying to redefine what a recession is because, just in general, a recession is hard to find. Like you mentioned, there's a whole board of economists who meet. Kind of the rule of thumb is that two quarters of negative GDP is technically a recession, but then these people meet and they go over a bunch of nuanced data and take a bunch of time and then declare it a recession. But it is kind of like a lipstick on a pig scenario where like Alex said, they're just trying to get ahead of bad news. So when they're doing stuff like this and drawing attention to it, you can pretty much guarantee that we're getting some we're likely to get some more negative economic data. And I think they did this in front of the negative GDP that came out. Was it last week? Did we get negative GDP numbers the second round? Yeah. So they're trying to draw attention to the fact that it's not technically a recession, which they're right, but it is kind of a lipstick on a pig scenario. That Drew brought up the milk is that if it's past the expiration date or close to it, I will throw that sucker out. I will not drink.
You don't do the smell or the taste test?
I think milk smells bad in general, so I wouldn't know.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, all right. Sorry, Alex. You look like you're going to say something.
No. I'm good. I'm
okay.
good.
All right. So we will go to the first ever mailbag round. All right, we've been getting more and more interaction from with some of the people who listen to the show, which is greatly appreciated. We really like the interaction and the questions. And this week we had enough questions to actually do our first mailbag segment where we're basically just going to answer listener questions. We've gotten a few emails over the last week with some questions. So the first one goes to Drew here. Is that and it basically says, how does the high price of gasoline, which appears to be coming down, make life easier for the lower class?
I think that's pretty simple. Lower income households spend more of their budgets on transportation and other necessities than higher income earners. So as gas prices start to go down, it'll alleviate the pressure on other budget necessities. For example, maybe if you're spending 8% of your budget on gas, as it goes down, you might only be 4 or 5 or 6% of your budget. This will allow lower income earners to spend more on other things. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Unless you've completely changed your life where you bike to work and, being able to get around not having a car. Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is.
In which case you're just a freeloader because you're not paying the.
There you go. Yeah. All right. The next question is that when will the IRS roll out the one-page tax return? And so I'll just go ahead and take this question. The answer is probably not soon. So the closest I can get to being able to back up that answer is that back in 2005, the state of California tried something called the Ready Return, which was the brainchild of a law professor at Stanford University named Joseph Bankman. His proposal for the Ready Return was basically that the IRS would send you a form, said how much you make, you would review it, sign it, send it back into the state of California, and your state taxes would be done. When he did this, they did a bunch of research, what they call it, they did a bunch of surveys and asked people how they like it, and it got like a 99% approval rating from the people they surveyed in California. But the proposal was defeated by one vote when it came up for a vote in the California legislature. Joseph Bankman seems to think that there's not much hope for anything like this happening in the future, mostly because the reason it got defeated in California, which he claims was from powerful tax software lobbies like Inuit, who would show up and basically lobby governments and say, this isn't, you're going to put a whole industry in jeopardy. It's better that Americans have more engagement in their tax returns than less. And they spend a lot of money and send these people out to talk to all these legislators, Congress people to make sure that they're not going to like do something like this, because obviously they want to protect their industry. Planet Money did a whole episode on this called Tax Hero. It was episode 760, and so if you want some detailed information on it, I recommend listening to that. But to sum it up, I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon. Yeah. All right, next question is that this one's for Alex, directed to Alex. And it basically says, it looks like Alex is in his home on the screen. Have you permanently quarantined Alex from the office? You want to clarify that one?
So I'll just tell you briefly the story. So I started working at Cocoa Enterprises in 2013, and I believe it was 2014 that Joe was starting to look at renovating the other side of the building. So most people, when they go to Cocoa Enterprises, they see the original side of the building. But the other side of the building we actually own as well. And that used to be a series of like 4 offices and a closet and a receptionist area. And Joe wanted to turn that into a conference room. And so the whole area was going to be renovated. And I was basically told, hey, you're going to be working from home until this renovation is done. And that had always been something that I had thought would be cool to do, thought would be interesting. So it was I was pretty excited about it. Went home, started working, and about a month later, I was like, hey, this is pretty great, actually. It's better than I thought. I'm not spending all this money on gas. I'm getting more sleep at night because I don't have to get up as early, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just asked Joe, I was like, hey, can we make this a permanent thing? And he said yes. And for a few years after that, I was still coming in to the office on a somewhat regular basis. But then when Drew came on board to Cocoa Enterprises, the office that he's in now, that used to be my office. And that's the only office on the other side where there's now a conference room. So then Drew took over the office that I used to come into. And so at that point, there was basically no more room at the inn for Alex. And so now I just work from home pretty much full time.
Yeah, I think you were in the office for a little bit in June, but before that, I can't remember the last time you've actually been in the office. It's been a while.
It was December because I think I had to cover a day in December for multiple vacations, but that was like one day. And then before that, I think it had been like before COVID.
Yeah.
So
You used to come in, was it once a month to update computers? And we also have our team meetings.
yeah, so the main purpose was to come in and back up my files on the office hard drive. But now since we do share file, that pretty much stopped with COVID. And then since we do share file now, there's no need for it anyways, since we're backing everything up to the cloud. So since then, I've been told just don't even, if you're going to come in here and hit copy paste and then twiddle your thumbs, don't waste your time. So, yeah. But yeah, I haven't been kicked out as far as I know, but I guess also I remember one time Joe told me that when I was working at the reception desk temporarily, somebody came in and I thought I was nice to him and everything, but they said I was nice to them in a way that a German airport security guard was nice. And so I guess since then I'm like, well, I guess I should stay away from the clients. So
I didn't hear that one. That's that was new. So very nice.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Yeah. All right. Next question. And this was for Joe, but he's out with COVID. So is that should you prepay your funeral expenses? And this specifically, they were talking about cremation expenses. But to answer the question, sure. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. You're all you're going to do is make life easier for the people that are going to have to take care of your estate when you're gone. If you don't prepay your expenses, it's probably going to have an immaterial effect on everybody's life. Because especially if you're going to like do cremation, but if you prepay them, it's just one more thing you have taken care of. It's certainly not going to hurt you, and it's just going to make things easier. So if you have the money and you want to prepay those expenses, I would say go ahead and do it. I don't know. What do you think?
At least prepay them. That's great. Or at least have the funds allocated for funeral expenses. You don't have to necessarily front the bill or have the bill paid, but have it written in your will, in the estate plan that, hey, upon my death, here's the funds that's going to cover these expenses. Dying is extremely hard for families and loved ones. So if you really want to demonstrate your love to your friends and family, make it easy after you leave.
Yeah. Unless you want to stick it to everybody, and then you make it.
Unless you want to stick it to everyone, in which case, yeah.
It usually comes to
really
us,
expensive
though, so.
funeral. Don't
Yeah.
That, or I guess for if there's any It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia fans out there, you could take the Frank Reynolds approach and just say, like, just throw me in the trash. So, don't worry about it.
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah, that is an approach. So, all right. Last question for the day, and this is just up for grab. Anybody can answer this one? But the last question is, what do you think will be the outcome of Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan? Is that when this came in, I don't think she'd gone yet, but since then, she definitely went. And what do you think is going to come of it, Alex? I know you follow this stuff pretty closely.
So I will take a minute or two to just give a little bit of background here for those who have not read any of my newsletter articles over the last year or so. Basically, the United States during the Communist Revolution did not have great relations with China except during World War II. After that, when their civil war kicked back off and the communists won, the United States largely backed the Republic of China based in Taipei, Taiwan, and did not have formal relations with the People's Republic of China based in Beijing. Well, fast forward to the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China have kind of a falling out. The Russians do not like cult of personality stuff anymore, and they want to try, it's a process called de-Stalinization. But the Chinese look at this as a direct attack on Mao, and so they have a falling out, and then they pretty quickly find themselves fighting a low-grade border conflict with the Soviet Union for several years. Nixon looks at this as an opportunity, goes to China, says, "Hey guys, we'll let you guys become, a big manufacturing powerhouse at our expense if you turn your guns and point them at the Russians and keep them pointed there." And for 50 years, we've recognized the Chinese government in Beijing and had a policy of what's called ambiguity towards the government in Taipei. Relations were pretty good from the 70s to the 90s. They kind of plateaued in the late 90s and into the 2000s, and then they started deteriorating again after a series of incidents. But I won't go too far into. But now relations are getting bad again. And what Pelosi's visit to me means is that the United States government is probably demarcating this as a moment when they're beginning, well, the policies really started under Trump, but they're really seriously starting to no longer take the ambiguous approach towards Taipei, and the great decoupling, as it's called, between Beijing and Washington is turning from, more of a let's just go our separate ways into an adversarial relationship. 50 years from now, we may look back at this moment as, this is someone who's 2 heartbeats away from the presidency making an official state visit to a country that, technically speaking, China is at war with and doesn't recognize its legitimacy. So we might look back 50 years from now at this being, one of those lines where, the process may have begun, but this is the demarcation where, we stopped being friends with China again and started becoming adversaries. These are 2 governments that are technically at war, and the People's Republic of China, they launched pretty significant military drills as a response. I think that the Chinese People's Republic of China believe the same thing, that this marks an end to good relations, whatever was left of them, with the People's Republic of China. And the United States is going to start actively backing the Republic of China, Taiwan, against them. So I think we're now past the friendly phase and are adversaries once again.
Wow, well said. Yeah, I can see this going a few different ways. My knee-jerk reaction is nothing's going to come of it. She's going to go to Taiwan. It's going to make headlines for a while, and that will be that. I could also agree with Alex. I could see this being like the shot heard around the world, where we look back in history, and this is the point where, there's the great decoupling, or it's more adversary. I could also see it being more of a political stunt, where, we're on the brink of a recession. Midterms are coming up. Things are tight. Nancy Pelosi just wants to make a political stunt and do something for the stance of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, all that is true. Also, I don't know when the news came out that Nancy might head to Taiwan, but once it came out, I'm glad she went, because if they didn't go, it would make it look like, the U.S. is afraid of China, and I definitely wouldn't want that. And I think she's going. I think what the U.S. is trying to do is trying to show that, hey, it's trying to be more assertive with Taiwan than they were with Ukraine. Is that they didn't, they had all these promises in place for the Ukrainians, but when push came to shove, the U.S. basically wanted to stay out of it, and I think they were kind of behind the 8 ball in that situation. I think they're just trying to stay ahead of the situation in Taiwan. They send Nancy over there, showing that we're supportive of Taiwan, and all this is, it's all great, it's all symbolic and stuff like that, but it doesn't really help Taiwan that much, because ultimately what they want is that they want the U.S. to protect them if the Chinese ever try to invade Taiwan. And that's still the big elephant in the room, is that we don't know if the U.S. did that. We didn't really look real great in Ukraine, and I think they're trying to work on that image with Taiwan. But there's still the elephant in the room, is that how far is the U.S. going to go to back up Taiwan if push comes to shove?
Well, I will say this. I think there have been several high-ranking Defense Department officials that have at least strongly insinuated that the United States would, in fact, if China launched an attack on Taiwan, at the very least, back our other Western Pacific allies in South Korea, in Japan, in assisting Taiwan. since technically we don't even recognize the government and there's no actual treaty of alliance, we wouldn't really have to if we didn't want to, but I think the basics are well, there's a coming change where I think at some point we're either going to have to make that decision or let China take Taiwan. Because right now they've moved hundreds of thousands of troops into the coastal region under the guise of a COVID lockdown. But a lot of people behind the scenes are like, they're moving troops to the coast. So I think that's probably part of it. Why Pelosi went is like, we're going to support them. You don't know if we're going to send the Navy in to the Taiwan Straits and start shooting if we have to. So I think that's probably part of it, but yeah.
All right.
We'll have to make that decision.
I guess real quick, I was reading, there's lots of theories that, the Chinese, people were worried that the Chinese might shoot down Nancy Pelosi's plane. Did anybody think that was actually a legitimate scenario? Because I didn't think the Chinese would do that. At least, I don't know where that came from. But I guess there was like 300,000 people watching her flight on flight radar 24/7. And they had to close the site down because everybody was either that interested or that concerned that something was going to happen that everybody logged on to watch it. I don't know. I didn't think that was a likely outcome.
That would be ridiculous. I mean, that would be an obvious act of war, and that would be a war that ultimately China could not win. We probably would have a tough time invading China, but I mean, all you have to do is bomb China's ports, and China, as you know, it stops existing.
Yeah, because that's where they're.
So that wouldn't be particularly difficult for the United States. So. Right. As long as nukes don't come into play, in which case we all have a problem. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll wrap up episode. I think this is 48 of Farm to Markets. Again, we really appreciate the questions. So if you want to send them in, please do. We love talking about them. Otherwise, I will see you again next week.